Okay, folks, we've been talking about the way out of chaos, and we described chaos. Chaos is stated explicitly in the second verse in the Torah, which is the second verse of the first chapter of Genesis. And there it says, "V'ha'aretz hayata tohu vavohu," the earth was void and chaos, tohu vavoyu, v'choshech al pnei tehom, and darkness on the face of the deep, darkness. Each of these represents a different exile. The exiles are, the first exile is Tohu, is Babylon, and then the second exile is the exile of Media and Persia, Media or Media and Persia. The third exile, which we spoke about last week, is the Greek exile, the exile of knowledge without wisdom. And finally, we come to the exile of Edom, the exile of Rome. Rome represented by the color red and represented by the name Edom, which is one of the names of Esau. And he plays a very big part in this whole story, in this whole saga of the exile. So this is the fourth exile, the fourth and the final exile, actually, which the redemption from this exile takes a very long time. And the reason that it takes so long is because it requires us to do something about it. Previous exiles required an inner change. But as far as we're concerned, the fourth exile, the exile of Edom, of Esau, of Rome, requires more than just an internal change. It requires what is called in the terminology of the Arizal Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the idea of um, rectification. It's not only an inner change, but an external change in the outside world, rectification and restoration, which is called birur hanitzutzot, the clarifying or the uplifting or the disencumbering is one of the ways that they put it, of the sparks of holiness that are embedded in creation. Now, what happened? Let me just first explain, before I explain that whole concept of how these sparks got into all the rest of creation. Let me just explain that this is the one exile, as I mentioned, which has no end to it, no end in sight. Um, and the reason for that is very simple, because this exile is the exile of the shattering of the vessels of the world of Tohu. In other words, this exile is the one that, in a sense, encompasses all of the other exiles. Now, what's an exile? An exile is when you're out of touch with your inner self. But here it's not only you out of touch is the person out of touch with their inner self, but once they do get in touch with the inner self, then they still have work to do in the outside world. Now, it's a big question as to which comes first. Does the whole concept of getting in touch with one's inner self come first? Or does the concept of rectifying the outside world come first, and then thereby one comes to get in touch with one's inner self? Well, there's a big argument and big discussion about this, and there's various approaches, and perhaps we will talk about some of the approaches tonight. Um, and we will get some, yeah, okay, good. We'll get some insight into the various methodologies and so on and so forth. Okay, how did the Shvira come about? How did the breaking of the vessels? How did things become how does holiness become embedded within creation that we now have to extract it from the creation and restore it to its original holiness? So the verse, again, this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where it says, V'ha'aretz, the land, hayata tohu vavohu, was in a state of chaos and void, or void and chaos. V'choshech al pnei tehom, and darkness on the face of the deep. And then it says, V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. Now, that word hover, to hover, let me just share a screen over here. I'm going to share a whiteboard because this is an important concept. Okay, the word merachefet is spelled like this. This is in Hebrew. Now I'm writing with a mouse, so it's not the most it's not the most convenient thing to write with. And also, I'm writing with the opposite hand because my mouse is on the right. I'm actually a lefty, believe it or not. Okay, but anyway, this is the word merachefet. Merachefet means to hover over. But Arizal points out that this actually forms two words. You take the mem away from here and the taf away from here, and switching the order a little bit, it's this word over here spells rapach. Rapach means 288. Sorry, the gematria, the numerical value of the word rapach is 288. Right, so that's 288. These are 288 sparks of holiness that fell, or to put it more accurately, they died. The letters, the remaining letters, once we've taken out these letters, the remaining letters, mem and taf, spell in a different order. Spell the word, I'm sorry, spell the word not in a different order, in the right order. Spell the word mate, right? They died. They died means they fell down to a lower level of reality. And our duty is to turn them around so that it becomes the same letters. Turned around spells the word tam. Um, Tam meaning pure or complete. Now you'll notice that the letter mem over here is written in a different form from over here when it's written as a mem, or in script it would be written like this. Right, in script it would be written like that. That's the mem, the final mem, and in script the regular mem would be written like this. Right, that's called a mem sofit, an end mem. There are 5 letters in the Torah that have different forms when they appear at the end of the word. These are called the 5 gvurot, the 5 severities. Why? Because they end words. So they have 2 forms, and they're called, these are the letters which are called mansapach. Mem, nun, tzadik, pei, and chaf. Chaf would be written like that. In the end forms, they would be written as, I'll just write it in script. Okay, I'll write in script form, not in writing form. Mem, nun, that would be written as a tzadi, right? The pei would be written like this, and a chaf is written like this, right? Mansapach, they call it. Mansapach, the 5 gvurot. In any event, what happened when these sparks fell or died? Basically, the vessels shattered. Why did they shatter? Because there was too much light in them. Now, this is a concept which is very common in Kabbalistic teachings. In other words, the whole concept of the shattering of the vessels is a very major concept, a very important concept, and it's basically like this: what was the whole purpose of shattering of the vessels? Um, so the sages explain it like this: that it's boine almanas listor versus almanas livnot. God created the world; He built a world that would fall apart in order to have a world that is in a state of fallen apart that will be restored. But who's going to restore it is the question. And the answer is we have to restore it. It is up to man to participate in the creation by restoring the broken vessels. That's the whole concept of Rapach mate, the 288 sparks that resulted from the death of these vessels. The death means the breaking apart and the falling to a lower level of these vessels. And our duty is to restore things from below to above. They fell from a state of above to below, and our duty is to restore them from below to above. This is called birur hanitzutzot, clarifying, rectifying, elevating the sparks of holiness that are embedded within creation. In other words, we become part in a sense, we become part of the Creator, and I'm going to speak about that a little bit more towards the end of this class. But that's what the whole concept of the battle between Jacob and Esau was in fact all about. Rebecca, Rivka, that was Jacob and Esau's mother. She was married to Isaac, to Yitzchak. So Yitzchak and Rivka, Isaac was at a certain point in time, he went blind. In other words, he didn't see the world anymore. All he saw was the light of the upper world. In fact, he was from the time of the Akedah, when he was almost offered up by his father, by Abraham, on the altar as a test. God told him to offer him up, and that was a test for Abraham. But at the same time, Isaac was elevated, Yitzhak was elevated to a level beyond which he had much connection at all with the physical world. His only connection really with the physical world after this incident was the flow of energy or the flow of light which came out of him downwards. But as a result, he did not see the evil in his son Esau. He only saw the potential. And that's why he wanted to give Esau the blessing. He told him to go and bring a sacrifice, and go and make a sacrifice, catch some game, and make an offering, and then prepare matamim, to prepare various types of food for Isaac. And in other words, he wanted him to do certain things. He had arranged Isaac had arranged that there would be various sparks in the food that was brought to him, and by blessing the food and then by blessing his son who had brought that food to him, by blessing him, he would elevate him. The problem is, he didn't realize, being that he did not see evil anymore, he didn't realize that that blessing would have been a blessing for nothing. It would be called in Hebrew a bracha levatola, a blessing that doesn't go anywhere. In other words, it's in vain, a blessing in vain. Why? Because Esau was not holding by being rectified. He was already in another stage of evil, of dissolution, of breaking apart, of separation that could not be rectified by a blessing. It had to be rectified by action. It had to be rectified from below to above, not from above to below. The blessing is the act from above to below. Action is from below to above. And it was left to Jacob. Rebecca, Rivka saw this. She understood what the situation was, and she told her son, Jacob. Jacob and Esau were twins. Yaakov and Esau were twins. She told her younger son, Yaakov, who was an ish tam. You remember the word tam? The word tam was what we said before. He was already in a state of rectification. He was in the state of rectification. He was a tam. He was a pure individual. His heart was pure. And so she told him, Yaakov ish tam Yoshev Ohalim. He was a pure person sitting in the tents, trying to learn the divine wisdom, trying to absorb and live by divine wisdom. And Rebecca sees that this is the case, and she understands that the blessing should not go to Esau because that blessing will destroy him. If a person is given a mission that there's no way that he can complete, since he's already been given the mission, that will destroy him. When an emissary does not fulfill his mission, he is responsible, therefore. And she understood that Esau would be destroyed if this mission was actually given to him. So she sends in her younger son, Jacob. He was born, they were twins, but he was born second. She sends him in disguised as Esau, and the father being blind, Isaac being blind, doesn't realize, or actually he does realize because he says, um, he realizes that something is going on. He hears from the tone of voice and the kinds of words that Jacob is uttering are very different from Esau. from what he was used to with Esau. So he says, "Come over and let me feel you." Now Jacob had gone in disguised as his brother, and he also had Esau was very hairy, and Jacob was actually not hairy at all. So Rebecca understood that Isaac might touch Jacob, and she put fur, goat wool, goat fur on his arms, so that he felt like Esau. In any event, Isaac blesses him, and he says, "Hayadayim." First of all, he says, "Hayadayim de Esav." Hakol kol Yaakov, Hayadayim de Esav. The voice is the voice of Jacob. It's the voice of prayer. It's the voice of Torah discussion. It's the voice of revealing godliness. But the arms, the hands, are the hands of Esau. In any event, he blesses him and so on and so forth. And then shortly after that, after he blesses him, Jacob goes out and Esau comes back from hunting, having prepared this food for his father. And then his state of anguish is he's terribly anguished about the fact that Jacob took the blessings. Jacob had already actually bought the firstborn, the privileges of the firstborn. He'd bought them prior to this from Esau. Um, Esau despised the duties of the firstborn, which up until the time that the Torah was given, the duties of the firstborn were the spiritual duties in the family. And Esau was definitely not. He was a hunter. He wasn't a man of the spirit. Again, Rivka understood this, and therefore she wanted Jacob to receive the blessings, and that's actually what happened. And then Esau is extremely angry. He gets the blessing anyway from Isaac, but there's enmity between them for a very long period of time until Jacob returns from his sojourn with Laban. Why am I telling you this story? Because essentially, this whole story is the story of the Jewish people, essentially, that they get sent into exile. And in exile, they do what Esau was not able to do, what the nations of the world were not able to do. They rectify and elevate and bring together all the sparks. Most of the sparks were buried or they were gathered into Egypt. And when the Jews left, the Israelites left Egypt, they took with them 202 sparks of the 288. 202 is the gematria, the numerical value of the word Rav. The Erev Rav Alu Itam, the mixed multitude that went with them, they were the ones that contained the sparks, which is why Moses wanted to take them out. Those were the 202 sparks. But there were left 86 sparks buried within creation. The word 86 is gematria, is the numerical value of the word for nature in Hebrew, hateva. It's also the gematria of the name Elokim. Elokim is the midah, the name which is associated with the idea of gevura, with the sphira of gevura, gevura being on the left column of sphirot, and the sphira that's associated with fear and with power. It's associated with fear and with power. So Jacob has um, the duty of Jacob and his descendants, that's us, have the duty of transforming this lust for power, which Esau had. He had the lust for power on a negative level, and that lust for power has to be a lust for that attribute of godliness which is expressed in the name Elokim. That's why it says, "V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim," was the spirit of Elokim that hovered over the waters. Why? Because that's what has to be rectified and brought into the um, realm of compassion and the realm of infinite light. The realm of infinite light. I'll just show you that. Let me get another screen, share screen here. Second, let me clear this. Why doesn't it clear? Okay, here we go. Clear all drawings. Okay. Um, the name Elohim is spelled like this in Hebrew. Elohim, right? That's how it's spelled. And the gematria, the numerical value of that is 86. Now, the Kabbalists point out that 86 spells the name Yud He Vav He, which is, everyone says in English, they call it Jehovah, right? Jehovah, or Yud He Vav He. We actually don't say it. We don't say this name in Hebrew. We don't say the name because it's a very holy name and we don't say it. But that represents the idea of transcendence, infinite transcendence, right? This is God within nature, and this is the infinite transcendence of God. Both of them happen to be divine attributes, but nevertheless, this is infinite, and that is the manifestation of godliness within the finite world, within nature. 86 is Gematria Hateva, right? Hateva in Hebrew would be spelled, would be called, Hateva. Hateva. I must apologize to Ernest again for not connecting. I forgot to connect my pen. Um, in any event, okay. So Havaya is the gematria of Havaya is 26. And I know some of you don't like gematrias. I'm not that fond of them myself either, but this is kind of instructive. And the word kli is the word kli meaning a vessel is 60, right? So together this would be 86. Right. So in other words, when um, when it's revealed as nature, then it requires a rectification. What's the rectification? That its inner nature will be revealed. That it's really only a vessel for the transcendent aspect of godliness. Kli means a vessel, and the name Havaya is the transcendent aspect of godliness. Right. So that's really what the rectification is essentially all about. That's what the rectification is all about. Okay. Now, to explain that a little bit better, because the concept of rectification is something that we really have to understand and work with, because that's really what we're supposed to be doing. One of the ways of rectifying in the most productive way of elevating the sparks and rectifying the world is essentially to build a tabernacle. Someone asked a question. Let me just answer this question first. If the sparks were embedded within the Erev Rav, why was it a bad thing to bring them? And if they were redeemed, why are they a source of evil? Very, very good question, Elisheva. Again, if the sparks were embedded within the Erev Rav, within the mixed multitude that Moses brought out of Israel, brought out of Egypt, why was it a bad thing to bring them? And if they were redeemed, why are they a source of evil? Very, very good question. And the answer is because the Israelites did not yet know how to do the rectification. They didn't yet have the means of doing the rectification, and that's why it was a little bit too early to bring them out, right? It was a little bit too early to bring them out. They could have come out later, or they could have come out had they had the means of rectification. And that rectification hadn't yet taken place. When did the rectification take place? After the sin of the golden calf. So what happened was, let's just chronologically, I don't want to go through the whole chronology, but they left Egypt, then they crossed the Red Sea, the sea split. Then they eventually, after 40 days, came to Mount Sinai on the 40th day. They received the Torah, and shortly after that, they worshiped the golden calf. Who worshipped the golden calf? This Erev Rav, right? So what does God do? He says, okay, now give me your gold, silver, not everything you have, but some of your gold, some of your silver, some of your jewels, some of your special wood, acacia wood, and animal skins and wool and so on and so forth. Basically, a bit of everything that you have, donate. Give it to the building, the construction of the tabernacle, which was constructed in the desert. Now, here's the lesson. The idea is as follows: whenever there's a state of chaos, whenever there's a state of negativity, when there's a state of evil which is dominating the situation, the way to deal with it is not to deal with it directly. In most cases, some cases you have to deal with it directly, but in most cases, the way to deal with it, if it's evil that can be rectified, there's a certain type of evil that cannot be rectified, that actually is relevant to the story of Purim, where the seed, the descendants of Amalek, the Amalekites, Haman was a descendant of Amalek. That cannot be rectified. That attribute of evil cannot be rectified. It's not possible to rectify it. It's not possible to elevate it. That has to simply be destroyed. There's certain things that can't be improved upon, and they have to be destroyed. Amalek is one of them. Haman was one of them. In any event, what is those things that can be rectified? How do we do it? So we see that throughout the journey in the desert, until the point in time when God says to them to build a sanctuary, to build a tabernacle, there was all kinds of complaints and all kinds of sinning and all kinds of things were going on, and they certainly fell short. And after all, they had a slave mentality, and they had not yet experienced true freedom, and they hadn't experienced a sense of purpose. So, what was it that God told them to do? Told them to build a tabernacle, and that gave them a sense of purpose. But not only did it give them a sense of purpose to have something that they had to do to build towards a better future, towards a higher world, towards a manifestation of godliness in the tabernacle, but they had to give of themselves. They had to give of their own possessions. They had to give up something. In other words, what God had asked them to do was to change the mindset of a slave, which is simply to receive. After all, he's only a slave and there's a master above him. That whole concept of just simply receiving and receiving and receiving and receiving and only doing the bidding of the master, but not ever thinking for yourself and not ever changing the world as such. You only do what the master tells you. The paradigm is now completely turned over, as it says about Purim, Nahafoch, everything has to be completely turned over. And now you have to donate. You have to donate of yourself. You have to donate of something that belongs to you. When you give something of yourself, something that belongs to you, something that's yours, you give it towards a higher cause. You donate your activities, your actions, your thoughts, your possessions, whatever, to a higher cause. That's the unifying factor which actually brings about the tikkun. That's what the tikkun is. And therefore, the tikkun, one of um, the Aramaic translation, of the word garment is the word tikkun. In other words, the word tikkun doesn't only mean rectification; it means making a vessel for something, making a garment for something, making something in which the infinite can be clothed, so to speak. In which the infinite can be clothed, so to speak. And that was the whole concept of the temple. Give something of yourself, and all of those things that are given together become part of a higher structure, a higher reality, the temple, the tabernacle, the Mishkan in Hebrew. And what is revealed in that is therefore the divine presence. But when the divine presence is revealed in that temple, then everything is elevated. Everything is elevated to a much higher level, and all of it together. And it doesn't matter what a person gave, everything that he gave or she gave was elevated to whatever a person gave was elevated to a higher level. And that is essentially the concept of tikkun. The concept of tikkun is not waiting for someone to rectify me, but giving something of myself to rectify together with everybody else for the sake of a higher cause, for the sake of a higher thing, for the sake of the divine presence. That's what it's really all about. So ultimately, therefore, the whole concept of rectification, of elevating these sparks, of changing the world, depends not on me taking anything from the world, taking wisdom from the world, taking whatever it is that I may happen to get, enlightenment from the world. No, it's the opposite, giving to the world, enlightenment, giving to the world of myself in order to make a better world, and so on and so forth. That's the entire the entire concept. And that actually has to do with this week's Torah reading, which is the reading of Truma. Truma is the donations and the gifts that all the Israelites gave towards the building of the tabernacle. That's what it speaks about. This week's additional Torah reading is about the story of Amalek, the destruction, the command to destroy Amalek. What's Amalek? The Amalekites. What do they represent? They represent Asher Karcha Baderech. They cooled you down along the way, cooling off your enthusiasm, making you cold to any spiritual enterprise, making a person cold to any spiritual uplift. Just sort of dismissing it as big deal, that kind of thing. And that is what the destruction of Amalek represents. It represents the destruction of the ice inside, so to speak, that which cools us off, that which makes us indifferent to divine events. There's a famous story, actually, about after the destruction of the temple, the sages were gathered together, and several of the sages were gathered together, and they saw a fox running out of the area of the Temple Mount, what had been the Holy of Holies, where the Holy of Holies was. They saw a fox running out from there. Everybody else was absolutely devastated when they saw this. Rabbi Eliezer expressed his tremendous anguish at seeing this fox run out of the Holy of Holies. And Rabbi Akiva laughed. Who was Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva was actually the son, the child of converts. And until the age of 40, he was a sincere person, but he was an ignoramus. Only at the age of 40 did he start studying, and he became perhaps the greatest sage of the oral tradition. In fact, the entire oral tradition goes according to Rabbi Akiva. He became the greatest sage. He also became a martyr. Eventually, the Romans put him to death. But Rabbi Akiva, when he saw the fox running out of the Temple Mount, the Holy of Holies, the area that had been the Holy of Holies, he laughed. And they asked him, what are you laughing about? There's no occasion for laughing. And he said, just as the prophecy about the destruction of the temple came true, so the prophecy about the rebuilding of the temple will also come true. And this is proof of it, that when we see the fox running out of the Holy of Holies, we know the destruction has already happened. Within the destruction comes the construction. In other words, we build out of destruction. That's where we build the construction. What did he mean? Out of the shattered vessels of the world of Tohu is where we start to build. Out of the negativity, out of the darkness, out of the state of chaos is when we start to lay the foundation for a new and a better and a more illuminated world, an enlightened world, let's put it that way. So how do we escape this pandemic? What do we fix? What are we to fix? What do we have to fix to escape the pandemic? Um, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I can answer it in a general sense. I think that everybody has their own particular tikkun that they have to do, their own particular thing that they have to do. But one of the things I think that's very important during this time of epidemic is the advice that the elder Hillel, the great sage Hillel, gave to somebody. There was a person who was a potential convert. Now, you probably know, I just actually posted recently on Facebook on my personal page. You can have a look for it, Rabbi Moshe Miller. I posted an article by Rabbi Steinsaltz, Adin Steinsaltz, Alav Shalom, who passed away recently. And he writes in this article about the idea of proselytizing. and how proselytizing is anathema in the Jewish way. We don't proselytize. If people want to come to Judaism, that's up to them. They should be discouraged initially. That's Jewish law. They should be discouraged because it's a difficult path, and it's not necessary for everybody to travel this path. But if a person pushes his way through and that's what they decide that they want to do, then it's possible to accommodate them. Let's put it that way. In any event, Rabbi Hillel was approached by someone who was thinking of converting to Judaism, and he said to Hillel, "Tell me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot." In other words, you can't stand on one foot for very long, so I need it encapsulated in like one brief teaching that will essentially encapsulate everything. And so, what did he say? What did Hillel say? He said that Ma dasani lach al tavi lechavrach. What is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Do not do unto other people. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself. He had to tell him in the negative because this man, as yet, was not converted, and he perhaps wouldn't have understood what it means to um, to achieve the higher level of love, which is the higher level of love is again the concept of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, love your fellow as yourself. He first had to be taught what is hateful to you, do not do to others. That was the first step. That's the first step in. Uh, uh-huh. So anyway, not the pandemic, the plandemic. um, okay. So 1 second now. As far as fixing the pandemic is concerned, the pandemic, I think that one of the first things is think about your neighbor, think about your fellows. Do they have what they need? Are there older people that are in dire straits? Perhaps they don't have food. Perhaps they don't have heating. Perhaps they need things. Perhaps they're in a state of need or a state of want, and we have to think about them, and not only people who might be in a state of need, but people who are in a state of psychological need. One of the big problems with the isolation that people feel is that there's real isolation. People start to go nuts from being isolated. They have no one to talk to. They have no one to communicate with. And since the human being is essentially a speaking creature, a human being is a speaking creature. And this is what it says in when God breathed, the breath of life into Adam. The verse is Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. So the Targum Unculus, the Aramaic translation of the Torah, says after this, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Vayhi lenefesh chaya, and he became a living creature. So the Targum says on the verse, he became a living creature, lenefesh chaya. It's leruach mamalala. He became a speaking person. He had the gift of speech. So communication is extremely important, and how we communicate with others is obviously extremely important. And that whole idea of communication, of talking, of using speech to build is essentially the way God built the world. The world was created with 10 utterances, and these utterances are the creation of the world. We recreate the world and we give the world its divine purpose by, again, by speaking out words of godliness, words of holiness, words of bringing other people closer, words of love, and so on and so forth. That's what's important um, in order to express the godliness in the world, which is the concept of unity and rebuilding the vessels and so on. Now, Martin turned out pointed out that isn't the first step to love yourself. Well, it depends on what we mean by love oneself. Yes, it's true. Love your neighbor as yourself, but loving oneself to very much tend towards egotism, And unfortunately, those of you who are a little bit older will see sometimes in some of the younger generation, not everybody, of course, but some of the younger generation, you'll see this sort of tendency in the younger generation that I come first. Um, I come first. After I've satisfied all my needs and desires and so on and so forth, maybe I'll think about someone else. It can be a dangerous way to put it. When we say to love yourself means something else, it doesn't mean self love in that sense, like in the narcissistic sense. The whole story of Narcissus, where he caught sight of his reflection in the water and he fell in love with himself. We don't mean it in that sense. We mean it in the sense of if you love yourself, you love the divine aspect that is within each and every one of us. In other words, the divine spark within each of us, the soul, essentially. The soul, if we love the soul within us, in other words, if we love it and intend to bring it out into full revelation, yes, then that is a prerequisite, yes. And true that if one hates oneself, you're likely to blame others. That does happen. Definitely, that definitely is true. So one has to come to love oneself, but oneself, let's say, with a capital O, oneself. In other words, the oneness in yourself, the oneness of God within yourself, because ultimately that's all that there is ultimately only godliness. So that's the idea. And that is essentially the tikkun, ladies and gentlemen. That is the tikkun, to express the oneness of God in the world through actions and speech and thoughts of kindness. It's definitely levels of rectification, beginning levels through action, then it goes to speech, and then it goes to thought, the highest level. But we all started with action, and it doesn't mean that action should ever be abandoned. That's always, even when one goes to a higher level in speech and in thought, action should not be abandoned because that is the outer casing, so to speak, of the vessel, and that's what makes it strong. Ben says, human love tends to be self centered. I will love if I receive love. Love of the divine is to love the spark of God in each and every one, including oneself. Unconditional love. Absolutely. That is correct. 100%. Um, Human love does tend to be self centered. It tends to ask for reciprocity, which is interesting. Interestingly enough, it says, therefore, that there's a verse that says as follows. We just learned, said it last week in Mashpatim. It goes like this: if you see the donkey um, of someone you despise, actually someone you hate, im tireh chamor sonacha. If you see the donkey of someone you despise struggling under its load, the donkey's overloaded. Azov ta'azov imo, help him out. Help out your neighbor to unload the donkey, which the Baal Shem Tov explains as when you see somebody struggling under their load, even if you hate him, which you shouldn't do, but even if you do, for whatever reason, maybe even for valid reasons, azov ta'azov imo, then you have to attempt to lighten the burden upon him and help him to bear his burdens that ultimately he has to bear. But even someone you despise, someone you dislike, even someone you hate. Now, it depends, of course, on what the cause of the hatred is. If the cause of the hatred is that this person is the seed of Amalek, is an Amalekite, then I think there's no rectification. There's nothing that one can do. You have to just leave that up to God, and you're not obligated in such a case to help him. But we're not talking about that kind of thing. We're just talking about friends and neighbors and people in the community and so on. You might not like them particularly, but nevertheless, you have to give a helping hand. Okay. But if you hate something in someone else, isn't it likely you have some hatred towards yourself? Correct. That's the opposite of the story of, actually, the Baal Shem Tov says this too. Sort of the opposite of the story of Narcissus. Again, Narcissus saw his reflection in the pond in water and he fell in love with himself. And what Marty is saying, and this the Baal Shem Tov actually says this, that if you have hatred in your soul against somebody else, and it's baseless hatred. It's really not required. You can hate a person's actions. You don't have to hate the person. You can hate something that the person does, but not the person themselves. So if a person does feel hatred towards another person, not just the actions, but towards the person, then the problem is in yourself to a large extent. Usually, that's the way it is. Um, but So it's the opposite of when it's to see the hatred in somebody else is a reflection of what it is in yourself. In fact, I think I spoke about that either last week or the week before. That why is it that we see certain things in order for us to rectify them within ourselves? We see certain things that we dislike in other people. See that first of all that issue is really something in yourself that needs to be rectified, needs to be corrected. Now that often happens with people people who are not on a very elevated spiritual level. People on an elevated spiritual level, tzaddikim, see in other people what needs fixing in them. But what we see, the average individual sees in another person, is what requires fixing in us. God has the kindness to show us that negative aspect and arouse our dislike, our hatred, our this, feeling of despising that particular thing, in order to realize that this is what we need to rectify in ourselves. All right, I think I'm going to have to stop here because I actually have to go to someone. I have to go to a friend who's making what's called an askara, memorial for his mother who passed away a year ago. So if there's any questions, quickly I'll try and address them. If not, next week is Purim. Yes, I mentioned in the beginning there won't be a class next week. There will not be a class next week, and everyone who celebrates Purim should enjoy it to the fullest. All right.